Welcome, I'm Ryan from Bluewood Gaming, and today I'm going to be going over a complete build guide for Flicker Strike in 2.6. Now, you might be wondering, since 3.0 is coming out soon, will this build be affected in any way? Because Flicker Strike does use Ignite. And the answer is no. The way that they're changing Ignite is damage over time. But what this build worries about is the actual igniting enemies, not the damage from Ignite, because the enemy's usually dead by that point. So let's get right into this. Starting with what even is Flicker Strike. Now, if you want to see some extended gameplay of Flicker Strike, you can go look on my channel. There is a video that is about 10 minutes long of me going through an area using Flicker Strike. If you want to see the actual skill, here you can see it. Flicker Strike teleports the character to a nearby monster and attacks it with a melee weapon. If no specific monster is chosen, one is picked at random. The cooldown can be bypassed by expending a frenzy charge. So this build is pretty much built around trying to get as many frenzy charges as possible, capitalizing on having frenzy charges, and just doing a lot of damage. So let's get into it with the items that we are using. This version of Flicker Strike runs off Oro's Sacrifice. Now, I've seen a few other different weapons that are used for Flicker Strike builds, but this is essentially the one used for the cheapest version of Flicker Strike. I've seen some versions of Flicker Strike builds that use things like Skyforce and Headhunters, and just all these crazy expensive items to get this build to go, and this build doesn't need that. The downside is the builds that use things like Headhunters and such, they can run higher level maps, and they can fight things like Atziri and Shaper, where this can't really do that. The single target damage on this is the biggest flaw to this, and I definitely do not recommend using this in any sort of hardcore league, as there is points where you will just instantly die. As you can see down there on the left, we are actually a life-based build with only about 4,000 life, and once we reach level 100, we'll only be at about 4,500 life, so really not that much, and I wouldn't recommend taking this to any like extreme in-game content like Shaper or anything like that. So now, why are we using Oro's Sacrifice? Well, if we look, Flicker Strike, we can bypass the cooldown by expending a frenzy charge, and on Oro's Sacrifice, we get a frenzy charge if an attack ignites an enemy. So when we attack a bunch of enemies, we can ignite them, and we get frenzy charges, and then we can use the frenzy charges to Flicker Strike more, and then get more ignites, and that's kind of how the chain goes. The chain is normally not even broken. I've gone on chains of almost 75 enemies. I've been able to go into breaches, hold down the Flicker Strike button, and not stop until the breach is over with. That's how much you can actually sustain this. And we're using Oro's Sacrifice because there's actually a lot of ways to get extra fire damage. So that's just what we're doing. Then the extra attack speed is also nice, but it's mostly the frenzy charge on Ignite. For this, it's also great to have a 6-link Oro's Sacrifice that is 2 green sockets and 4 red sockets. The problem is those cost about 5 exalts each, where something like what I have, which is a 5-link with 1 green socket, costs somewhere in the range of 30 to 40 chaos, which is much more manageable than 5 exalts. So let's go over what we have socketed in here. Obviously, Flicker Strike, connected with multi-strike support. This is just more chances to ignite enemies, giving us more frenzy charges, which lets us go even more. Weapon elemental damage, obviously it's more damage. Melee splash support, we're going to be running into groups. Obviously, this just helps us kill groups faster. And then fire penetration support for even more damage. Pretty simple. If we had this socket here be green and connected, then we would run something like probably Mana Leech is what I would go with, but there's a few others that you can look into. I don't remember any off the top of my head besides Mana Leech, but there is quite a few that you could use there. Actually, just remembering it now, the actual thing that you would want to use is either Mana Leech, Life Leech, or Faster Attacks. Mana Leech and Faster Attacks are both the green gems, so that's what you would use in that socket. Now, moving on to the easy thing, the chestplate is Kaom's Heart, because this gives us more fire damage and extra life, which were already really small amount of life, so this just increases it a whole lot. In fact, I'll even show you how far down we go. See, without Kaom's Heart, we are at 2,388 health. With it, we are up to 3,438. With the full tree all the way out, we can get about 210% life, so that gives us a whole bunch extra life with Kaom's Heart. Do not worry about getting Legacy Kaom's Heart, because that actually takes away the fire damage buff that we get with this non-Legacy version. Although that version does give you 500 extra life, the added damage does outweigh the life that we would gain because of things like Mana Leech, not Mana Leaf, but Life Leech and stuff like that. Next up, we use Snakebite Assassin Mitts. This is because when we are at maximum frenzy charges, our attacks poison enemies. This is pretty great because we're almost always at maximum frenzy charges. This also gives us increased attack speed per frenzy charge. We are normally at 8 frenzy charges, I believe, is what our maximum is. No, my maximum is 7 right now, so an extra 2% attack speed per frenzy charge, so 2 times 7, 14% attack speed increase. We also get an increased accuracy rating, but as you can see here somewhere, our chance to hit's already 100%, so it doesn't really matter all that much about the accuracy. What we have on here, we have 2 green sockets and 2 red sockets. We use Faster Attack Support, Culling Strike Support, Ancestral War Chief, and Leap Slam. The Culling Strike and Faster Attack is for Ancestral War Chief. This we put down for bosses, as he just helps deal extra damage for bosses. He can also make the boss attack the totem instead of us, which is kind of great. And then we put Leap Slam on here because we already have Faster Attack, and we have a socket left, so we just put it here. Next, for the belt, we use Durrani's Invitation. This just gives us more fire damage and resistances. It also gives us more Life Leech, because 0.2% of fire damage is leeched as life. Because we don't deal any physical damage, all of our damage, or 0.2% of all of our damage, is leeched as life. Next, our boots, our Gang's Momentum Legion boots. This just gives us a higher chance to ignite and increase damage against ignite enemies. Because we are going to be igniting almost everything, because our chance to ignite is 42%, as you can see. Actually should bring that over like that. Yes, since you can see our chance to ignite is 42%. This really helps that. And then we also get increased movement speed, and the added armor and energy is also pretty great. The links here are increased duration support, Summon Flame Golem, Cast When Damage Taken support, and Immortal Call. This gives us, whenever we take damage, it casts Flame Golem and Immortal Call. We do actually get quite a few endurance charges. I'll tell you how we get that here in a minute. But this just discharges endurance charges, making us invulnerable to physical damage for a short time, proportional to how many endurance charges were expended. I'll tell you how we get endurance charges here in a bit, but we are also normally at max endurance charges, which currently we can only have up to 3. That number we don't really increase because it doesn't matter all that much, but that's just something else that we get to do. And then the Flame Golem, it just gives us more damage, so that's why we use it. Moving up to the headpiece, this is Heretic's Veil Deicide Mask. We use this because of the level 22 Blasphemy. We do use some curses, so this saves us a slot, and it also gives us reduced mana reservation, which is also pretty great. And the +1 to socketed curse gems is also pretty great as well. Now, these can actually run quite a bit. I think that these Heretic Veils go for around 30 chaos right about now. I forgot to mention Kaom's Heart's kind of expensive nowadays. Just try to find one for cheap. But going back to Heretic's Veil, what we want to have on here is Warlord's Mark, which is actually how we get our endurance charges. It also gives us Mana Leech and Life Leach, so just great things that we have. We also use Anger, which that is our other aura that we use. We only use those two. Flammability is the other thing that we have on here. We actually don't use Flammability, that's just an extra leftover thing that we had. And then finally, Haste. This should actually be Vol Haste, but I just don't have Vol Haste right now, so I threw in Haste to remind myself. So the level 22 Blasphemy is only for Warlord's Mark, but we can occasionally drop Anger and run Flammability. There's not very often that you want to do this. The only time that you actually would want to do that is if an enemy is resistant to fire, because Flammability gives negative to fire resistance. As you can see, negative 41% to fire resistance. That's pretty much the only time. Most of the time you'll be running Warlord's Mark and Anger as your two auras down here. Moving on to the rings and amulet. The amulet that we use is Carnage Heart Onyx Amulet. This does say we get physical damage leached as life, but that's not what we're using it for. It is for the increased damage while leeching and the increased life leech per second. Those are pretty great. And also the attributes, we need quite a bit of intelligence to use things like Heretic's Veil, so the added attribute points really help. Moving on to the rings, these are just rare rings. You want to pick up things that say increase to elemental damage with weapons and resistances. The resistances that we have, currently they're pretty good because I'm in my hideout, but these are normally hovering around 30%. So you really want to make sure that you have some amount of resistances, and you're mostly going to be getting these off these rings. Just make sure that you get resistances and elemental damage, because that's what you really want. And now down to flasks. These can actually be changed out a bit. This is just what I've been using. The first one is Blood of the Karui. This gives us just a regular life flask. I've found that occasionally we need this because we don't use something like Death's Door for our boot slot. We are still susceptible to bleed, so you would want to run something like this. Also, if you're running things like Lab, or anywhere that has traps in it, or just environmental effects that can damage you and bring your life down, this is really great to have. The next one after that is Zerphi's, or however you pronounce that, Zerphi's Last Breath, Grand Mana Flask. This is great because it says skills used during the flask effect grant 800% of mana cost as life. Now the mana cost of Flicker Strike is 56, and we attack with Flicker Strike 5.26 times per second. So 56 times 800% is something in the range of 400 to 500. I don't know the exact math right off the top of my head, but 400 to 500 times 5.26. With our health being at 3,438, we get most of our health back almost instantly. So that's why we use this. Just know that we can't really use this when we are not around enemies. We do have to be around enemies to actually use this to some effect. Next, we use Atrezi's Promise Amethyst Flask because we get extra chaos damage and extra physical damage and extra elemental damage. Those get converted into chaos damage, and then the chaos damage is leached as life. So this is really just something to convert some of our damage, give us a little bit extra, and to give us a little bit extra life gain. This is the first flask that I'd really take away because it doesn't really do all that much, but I just have it here because it's a slot that's filled. Next, we have Divination Distillate. This, obviously, because of the rarity and quantity increase that gives us during the flask effect. We use this when we're about to kill a boss to get the loot from him to be better. The increased light radius and elemental resistances are just meaningless. We're really just here for the increased rarity and quantity. And now for our final flask, it is the Overflowing Chalice. This is just used in case we need to instantly recharge the rest of our flasks. This is really just there as an uh-oh button or like an oops button, as something to instantly get the rest of our flasks back. And it looks like that menu has frozen up for some reason. There we go. So yeah, this is really something that you can replace too, but the things that you would replace these with, there's really two good things that you can replace them with. You can replace one of these with a Witchfire Brew, which would give you level 21 vulnerability around you, which would increase your damage a whole bunch. The damage over time that Witchfire Brew gives isn't all too useful, but that level 21 vulnerability does make some things go a lot faster. And then also, obviously, Vessel of Vinctar, but there's not really many builds that Vessel of Vinctar doesn't increase. So, okay, moving on to what we actually use down here. Obviously, Leap Slam. Sometimes we just need to get over to place, and we need an actual movement ability that doesn't require enemies to be nearby, and so that's Leap Slam. Obviously, Flicker Strike. Then we have Warlord's Mark and Anger, which are what we normally have. Just to show you what it looks like, this is how much mana we have left after putting those on, which is actually really enough for some of the things that we do. Pretty much everything that we do. You will occasionally hear the character say we're out of mana when you watch gameplay of Flicker Strike builds, but we get mana back so quickly that it doesn't even matter. Because of how much actual mana leech we have, because of Warlord's Mark and the 2% mana leech, we do gain quite a bit. As you can see, we gain 2 mana on hit when we only have an actual 102 mana that we can have. So we get quite a bit back. Then after that, flammability, as I already said, if you need to fight something with fire resistance or elemental resistance, you switch out Anger for flammability, and that really helps with that. As you can see right now, our fire resistance penetration is 34%. If I wait for this to go up so that I can use flammability, you'll see that go up quite a bit. So if we use that, doesn't actually show, but it does increase it by an extra 41%. Then the other things that we use are Ancestral War Chief, and then just Portal for right now because I don't have anything else to use there. Now moving on to the passive tree. As you can see, we are a ranger. We are actually a raider too. I haven't done Merciless Lab yet, but just zooming in here, for normal lab we get Quartz Infusion because it gives us phasing while at maximum frenzy charges, and we have phasing while we have Onslaught, and then we also gain phasing for 3 seconds every time we kill something. Then that gives us Avatar of the Veil when we go to Cruel, And this says that we are immune to elemental status ailments while phasing, which is essentially all of the time, and this also increases our elemental attack damage. When we go to Merciless Lab, we actually want to come down here and get Way of the Poacher, because as you see, it gives us 20% chance to gain a Frenzy Charge on kill, and 20% chance to gain a Frenzy Charge when we hit a rare or unique enemy, which lets us go more on bosses because they can be a bit of a problem. And then Uber Lab gives us Avatar of the Slaughter, so that we can get more increased movement speed, and attack damage while we have Frenzy Charges, or per Frenzy Charge, which, as you already saw, we have 7 available Frenzy Charges now, and then because of Avatar Slaughter, we get an extra one, which would bring us up to 8, which is a pretty good number of Frenzy Charges. That would actually be 16% increased movement speed, 24% increased attack speed, and 24% increased attack damage when we're at maximum Frenzy Charges when we have Avatar of the Slaughter. Now, moving on to the actual tree, I will go through how to actually level up with this tree. I will have in the description a level 90 skill tree for this. I'm currently level 74, so my skill tree is not filled out all the way, but I can run you through how to level up. Now, because of the gear that we are using, we cannot use Flicker Strike until level 68, but while we are leveling up, we want to use two-handed weapon skills, so that would be things like Cyclone, Sunder, Ground Slam. I use Cyclone personally to level up, but you want to use something like that to level up. And the path that we take while leveling is coming down here, getting the Evasion and Life nodes, going over and getting Finesse, then up to Heart of Oak, coming down here to this special Dexterity node, and then going left, coming all the way down here, skipping all of this stuff, continuing straight across this line. And the first major thing that we want to pick up is up over here with Resolute Technique, which says our hits can't be evaded, but we never deal critical strikes. Now, that is perfectly okay, and this actually helps leveling and Flicker Strike a whole bunch. So we want to go straight from this Dexterity node immediately over here to Resolute Technique, and then from that point, you can really choose if you feel like you need more health, then you come up here through Life and get Golem's Blood, and then continue up. This is personally how I went. I went up and got Golem's Blood, then came over here, up through the Strength nodes to get the two-handed melee damage nodes, over here and get Destroyer, then I went up and got Master of the Arena, then Bravery, and then Art of the Gladiator. And then at that point, I started actually going over here to the right. I would skip this part to begin with Primeval Force, because when we're leveling with Cyclone or Ground Slam or Sunder, you don't really need the elemental damage, so skip that for now, go up. Skip all of this for the beginning, go over and get the Thief's Craft nodes so that we can level up our intelligence gems while we're actually leveling. Then I came over, skipped Volpact, and went up, got Coordination, then Blood Siphon, and then Trickery. Then got Blood Drinker, then came back down here, got Vitality Void, went down and got Wrecking Ball over here, and then by that point, I was able to actually start using Flicker Strike. Actually, before using Flicker Strike, starting at level 62, there is 6 nodes that you want to get from 62 to 68. Those are these 2 Frenzy Charge nodes right here, the 2 up here, and then the final 2 right over here. That will give you the 7 Frenzy Charges that you can go to right away. You also, by the point of finally getting Flicker Strike, you want to have this gem slot open and potentially this gem slot open. By 68, the really The only things that you don't need to have by 68 are these nodes right here, which are weapon fire damage nodes. These, which is life nodes and bloodless. And then the other thing that you don't need Volpact right away, and you don't need these weapon elemental damage nodes right away, and also these. You can kind of get those after you get Flicker Strike, as once you're at level 68, you're pretty much to the point of being in Merciless at least Ledge, and without all these extra damage nodes, we can perfectly go through almost the entirety of Merciless solo. So you don't really need those, just level those up and get these nodes as you level. These special jewels that we have, one of them is required, one of them is not. There's actually 2 required jewels. One of them you want by the time that you get Flicker Strike, another one you don't need for a long time. The first one that you need is Fireborn. This says increases and reductions to other damage types in the radius are transformed to apply to fire damage. So that means that all of these two-handed melee damage nodes are increased to fire damage with two-handed melee nodes instead of physical damage. So here with Destroyer, it normally says, if I take this out, you can see it normally says 25% increased physical damage with two-handed melee weapons, and these are 12% increased physical damage. When I put it in, they become fire damage. Wow, that's okay. Yes, so these say 25% increased fire damage with two-handed melee, and 12% increased fire damage with two-handed melee. And the same story down here, 10% increased fire damage, and then this is 20% increased fire damage. So that is the first required jewel. Fireborn doesn't cost that much, only like a few chaos, I think. The next one that you don't necessarily need, you need to find something that gives +2 mana for each enemy hit by attacks. This is just something that I found that you're going to be running out of mana as soon as you switch over to Flicker Strike, or at least I did. To fix that, you can get a gem or a jewel that says +2 mana gain for each enemy hit by your attacks. If you don't run into mana problems, you don't have to worry about getting this flat or this jewel, but I did. I also got fire damage increase on it, and so that is perfectly fine jewel to get. The final jewel is something that you don't need to get for a long time. I don't even have it yet. It's over here. If you look at the level 90 skill tree, it says to get things like Barbarianism or Barbarism and Juggernaut, and then this jewel socket for the Red Dream, which is gives us fire resistance, and it gives us endurance charges. Or actually, it says something along the lines of actually, you know what? I will just pull it up. Okay, so the exact wording on it is passives granting fire resistance or all elemental resistance and radius also grant equal chance to gain an endurance charge on kill. And then we also gain 5% of fire damage as extra chaos damage. So it's an increase to our damage output, and then because of these saying increase to fire resistance and more elemental resistances, we put it there. The problem is the Red Dream currently costs about 2 exalts, and that's kind of expensive, so you don't really have to get that for a while. Now, something to note, you will see a lot of Flicker Strike builds start down here with the Duelist and go through here because all of these nodes are right here at the Duelist. The thing is, most of those builds go up over here to try to get the intelligence from this side, where we get it over here. I personally think that each side has its own strengths and weaknesses. I personally like the Raider Flicker Strike version, but the Trickster has shown that, well, not the Trickster, but the Duelist version has shown that if you put money into it, I'm talking like almost 100 exalts worth of money, that you can actually run things like Shaper. So if you want to invest a whole hell of a lot of money, then I would go to the Duelist version because it can actually run things like Shaper. I know that there's one guide out there for 2.6 actually has a Duelist that does something like 1.3 million DPS and kills Shaper. This is a lot cheaper than that. This is pretty much everything for the price of an Exalt. And yeah, this can't kill Shaper. So that is pretty much it for this build. If you have any questions or comments about it, then put it in the comment section. I will answer pretty much everything. And yeah, that's going to be it for this video. Remember, I'm Ryan from Blue Water Gaming. I'll see you guys in the next one.